Good morning, and thank you for being here. In order to summarize how this master's degree has enhanced my approach to teaching and learning music, I'm going to be sharing with you today curriculum and instruction that I've developed and applied in my classroom in order to develop 3 specific characteristics within each one of my students. Those 3 characteristics that I'm trying to cultivate are 1, a personal, meaningful connection to music and people, 2, a secure musical and emotional identity, and 3, a command of the musical language. I believe that these qualities establish the best and most fertile conditions out of which students can have aesthetic experiences with music, thereby increasing their desire to remain musically active after they graduate. I use the word cultivate intentionally to refer to a long line of educators and theorists who developed a student-centered vision for education in which the teacher carefully prepares in an educational environment and then nurtures the students, allowing them to grow holistically through a guided process of discovery about themselves, about other people, and about the world around them. We can trace this lineage all the way back to Quintilian, but I think it was especially well articulated in the works of Rousseau, Pestalozzi, Montessori, Brunner, Maslow, Rogers, and Vygotsky, and we'll talk a little bit about each of those as we go. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about how I conceive of my role within the music education profession, and just now we talked about a little bit of the historical development of my methodology. We'll look more at that as well as my personal philosophy. We'll define some terms that I'll be using and look at some graphic conceptualization of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about. And I can really think of no better way to explain to you how this program has impacted what happens in my classroom than for you to actually hear from my students. And so all throughout the presentation we're going to be reading some commentary from them. Then in the last section of the presentation we'll look at how these ideas have come to life in my classroom and what that has meant for me as well as my students. While I was searching for why these ideas became important for me to articulate, I came across this journal entry that I wrote during the very first day of the leadership workshop that I did last summer. I realized at the beginning of the day today that I had not done enough thinking about what I wanted to get out of the workshop. This seems to be an issue with my teaching as well, not planning the big educational goals and then designing instruction directly to meet these goals. When I first read this, it came as a bit of a surprise to me because I think of myself as a big picture person. But what I realize is that being big picture is different from beginning with the end in mind. Some of you might be familiar with this book, and the name Stephen Covey came up often during that workshop. I was teaching with passion in my classroom, but I didn't really have visionary leadership. What was my ultimate purpose as an educator, and what did my students need from me before they graduated? I didn't really have answers to these questions. So I did a lot of thinking about it and a lot of reflection, which led to my Gestalt moment. I wanted my students to be lifelong musicers. As Jellison suggests in her article about transition principle in Vision 2020, I wanted to set up my students so that they would pursue music after they left school. The term musicking was coined by David Elliott to refer to any type of activity that is directly involved in music making, and recent scholars such as Anne Clements have used it to describe any activity from singing in a choir to keeping a record collection. I really want my students to be musically involved throughout their lives because of how music elevates the human condition and the way that it fosters emotional intelligence and spiritual growth. Also being very influenced by P21, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, I know that music education can foster within my students skills that they will use their entire lives. In that same moment of insight, I also realized that we do music because we love it. And we love music because of the experiences that we have in it and the way that those experiences shape us and make us feel. So if I really wanted my students to continue making music a part of their lives, I needed to help them have those aesthetic or expressive experiences. My term paper for psychology during my second summer allowed me to explore this question: how can we teach towards expressiveness? I actually approached it from the opposite direction and said, what are the things that get in the way of students being expressive? Things like shyness, music that's too easy or too hard, a student having fear about expressing themselves, or just not feeling a connection to the music. So I dug into lots of sources that I found on ERIC and in the Handbook for Research for Music Education. And in looking what the literature had to say, I codified an idea which I'm calling the expressive prerequisites of relevance, esteem, and fluency, which are those three qualities that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And we're going to look at each one. First, let's talk about expressiveness. You're familiar with the writings on aesthetics by Bennett Reamer, and we can think then of expressiveness as communication that deals with information, but rather than it being factual information, it's affective information. Expressiveness is something that connects the hearts, or the emotional cores, as Lisk would call them, of two or more people, and it culminates in the aesthetic or expressive experience. And I think of this as being a platform for the peak experience that Maslow describes as being truly life-changing. Now, being unprompted by any of this information, just asked what expressiveness means to them, here are some things that my students said. Being expressive is being different from everyone else. Being expressive is to show your inner emotions in your own creative ways. Being expressive is being yourself. Being expressive means to take what one feels and turn it into something else that others can experience. And this one I like a lot because it's from a student of mine who's a special learner. Being expressive is a better way to be. This is the first of the three prerequisites, as I'm calling them, and my definition of relevance is a personal, meaningful connection with music and with people. Now, there have been a ton of learning theorists that talk about meaningful learning and curriculum that is relevant to the student. For me, this means taking both the emotional and the musical issues that we're dealing with in the classroom and connecting them directly to the student's life experience. Also, as a choral director, I want my students to understand and be able to relate to the text that we're singing. In the same essay where they wrote about expressiveness, this is something that one of my students said that I think relates. I believe that something is more expressive when the person conveying the point is passionate about what they're doing. Next, when a person has esteem, I think of that as having a secure musical and a secure emotional identity. If we think about the hierarchy of needs established by Maslow, the esteem needs right in the middle of that talk about things like having self-knowledge and a sense of belonging and social affirmation. Also, Rogers would tell us that the teacher needs to be aware of the student's individual characteristics and a personal identity so that we can connect with them. And I really want my students to identify as a musical person. One of my students said that for me, it's easy to be expressive because I'm not afraid of who I am. Fluency is a huge topic, and I really have just started to delve into it in terms of the thinking and reading that I've been doing. But I think of it as a command of the music language, and that encompasses both an oral and written understanding of music as a language and as an art. Like the great pedagogues that I've listed here at the bottom of the slide, I think of music and musical meaning as being acquired through observation and imitation, the same way that we acquire meaning through language, verbal language. Also, it's important for me to point out that I think of fluency as something that's relative to both culture and the developmental level of an individual, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. I've put together a few graphics here that can help us examine this concept in a different way. In this one, you can think of relevance and esteem as being a foundation that supports music language fluency, which is really the heart of music learning. And then this helps give rise to the expressive experience. In this one, which I call the tree of expressive music making, you can see how esteem and relevance act as the roots, and they draw from sources like mentors and experience and self-knowledge. These support the core of music fluency, which then can branch off into any number of aesthetic experiences. And these things lead to all the great things that we know music does for the soul, like empathy and spiritual connectedness. And of course, what's really most important that I'm talking about, the love for music. In this graphic organizer, or advanced organizer, like Saville would have us talk about, I was inspired by Covey again, and he defined a habit as being the intersection of knowledge, ability, and desire. In this way, we can think of esteem as being expressive knowledge, or knowledge of the self. Fluency is the ability to communicate, and then relevance provides the desire. The space in the middle is the space that a person has for expressive experiences. And we can all probably also think about performances that fit into these other places of intersection, like one that's confident and proficient but emotionally detached, one that's talented and passionate but shy, and one that's very emotionally connected, but there's a communication breakdown because of a lack of fluency. Also, if we take any one of these circles, fluency for example, and make it bigger, and watch the space in the middle, that space also gets bigger. So we can take any one of these qualities and help it develop within a student, and that will grow their capacity for the expressive experience. This is just my own speculation, but I think that Maslow would probably describe musical self-actualization as being the expansion of all three circles into one. Now that we've talked about this idea, we're going to take a look at how these concepts, how I first got a glimpse of them in my teaching before I actually articulated them all in this way. This is a visit from Saville-Iksic, and the educator Comenius would be happy to know, because of his desire to bring the world to the student, he'd be happy to know that I arranged to host this group from South Africa after hearing about their tour through America. I'm going to show you a 2-minute edited clip down from a 30-minute workshop that covers the entire span of the workshop. As you watch, see if you can lock into your mind the initial performance. Watch the way that the students are learning. We're going to talk about Lucy Green in just a second, but this is the beginning of the enculturation process that she describes in her work. Watch the students' faces and how they interact with other people, and then see at the end if you can make a comparison between the first performance and the last. Here's some things my students said after that experience. When we sang, one of the guys I sang with kept telling me, "I love your tenor." That was really cool to get a compliment like that from him. While Saville-Iksic was singing to us, I could not stop smiling. I felt I understood the passion they were expressing to us. When we got to join in and sing with them, it made me feel like a part of the group. Seeing the men of Saville-Iksic smile at the work we've done and jump in to sing with us stirred up such an awesome feeling. The most influential thing that happened during Saville-Iksic's visit was when they came up and sang with us. I got a great feeling and a strong love for music. When I read these, what I realized is that my students were describing aesthetic experiences. They felt like they were part of the group. They were learning a new musical dialect because they were interacting with native speakers. And this music suddenly had a brand new meaning to them because of these 10 men that were standing in front of them. I started to see now how my students were falling deeper in love with music when these three qualities started to come together. The next summer, I took Developing Vernacular Musicianship, and part of our class reading was a 2008 study by Lucy Green that looked at how informal learning can have a role in the music classroom. Now, in this way, Green really captured the spirit of Dewey's microcosm of society, school as microcosm of society, because it's this informal learning in which students are engaged in when they're actually musically active outside of the school. Green also emphasized student choice, which we see in the work of Montessori, teacher as facilitator, as Rogers would suggest, and it shows a value for the relationship that students have with the world. Taking this class also really validated my own experiences as a vernacular musician, so to speak, in middle school and high school. And this experience of mine was a really important part of my musical identity. And when I started teaching, I was really unsure about whether this was a type of learning that belonged in my classroom, because I felt like I was expected to do something else. But taking this class really emboldened me to try some new things. And in the following year, this past school year, I had the chance to teach a new class called Small Vocal Ensembles, where I tried out lots of different things that use this type of learning. So we're back to Stephen Covey here, and now that I had my big picture, I had the end of wanting my students to be lifelong musicers, it was time for me to put first things first. Covey describes this as ordering our roles into a prioritized list. And so now I had the three things that I think were most important for my students in terms of them loving music. And so I became really, really intentional about teaching towards these things. We're going to take a look now at how I've used relevance and esteem and fluency through the lens of the vernacular musicianship class and taught towards these three qualities within each one of my students. And we'll also take a look at the results as my students have expressed. First, when it comes to relevance, I want to know if my students care about what they're singing and can they relate to it. Also, do they care about the people that they're singing with and the people that they're performing for? In order for me to be able to say yes to all these questions, I allowed for a lot of student choice in repertoire and social informal learning, kind of like the social constructive model of Vygotsky. And I also created disequilibrium. This was a concept now that came to my attention when I took curriculum development during my first summer. And it's akin to the Piagetian term accommodation, where the mind actually has to change because it can no longer assimilate new information into its present schemata. The way that I did this with small vocal ensembles, which I might refer to as SVE, was right at the very beginning of the year. I told them, go, work together, pick a song, and come up with an a cappella arrangement of how to sing it. So they worked really, really hard, and for days. And they basically came up with nothing, and they were really frustrated. This was the disequilibrium, though, because they had something that they really wanted to do, but they realized now that they didn't know how to do it. They had to learn. And it set up every single thing that we did in that class for the entire year. And then that learning was really meaningful to them because they knew exactly how it was going to relate to their musical lives. Another way in which I taught for relevance was a themed concert. This was for my big choir now, and we focused on the idea of rich and poor. I was choosing the repertoire, but the students related it to their lives by reflecting on an individual piece, talking about it in a small group, sharing it with the class, and then writing a concert announcement that would be read right before the performance of the piece during the concert. This was the program that we performed on this concert, and you can see that we have some great contemporary composers like Eric Whitacre and Pepper Choplin. The song Tinasia Kala was one that we had actually learned from Tulasizwe during the previous year. And we also did a master composer piece on this concert. We ended the concert with a great arrangement of Leonard Bernstein's Somewhere. It just wasn't on the printed program because it was a surprise tribute to a retiring teacher. Now, performing all of this different repertoire requires many different approaches in producing the actual choral tone, which is one of the things that I really like about the methods of choral school D, E, and F. And if you want to know more about what I have done with the choral schools and with repertoire, it's in the section D of the handout. Moving back to what my students did, this was a guided reflection that they did on these songs. They were asked what their definition of poverty and wealth were. How does the song connect with these ideas? And not every song was about money, so they had to think outside the fiscal box. And then what textual and musical elements were important, not only to bring out as a choir, but maybe to educate the audience about before the song would be performed. This is one of the concert announcements written by a student. Hard Times Come Again No More is a parlor song written by Stephen Foster that asks the fortunate to consider the plight of those who are less fortunate. And then this student goes on to talk about the idea of hope and how it's developed in the song. This was the very first time that we performed a concert like this, and so I asked the students to write what they thought about it. I felt a personal connection with what we were actually singing. We learned to understand music in a new way and learn things about the world around us as well. I thought the theme was a great tool to help engage the singers as well as the audience. The audience can feel the difference between this type of performance and one that was done with no connection between the singer and the music. Let's take a look now at esteem. I really want my students to be willing to take risks because spontaneity is a major key in being expressive. Also, I want my students to feel like they have something to contribute, something to offer to the group. And the way that I did this year was to give them lots of opportunities to lead the group, to present in front of the group, to perform in front of the group. This was always followed by lots of peer feedback and plenty of positive reinforcement. Behavior psychologists would say that we do this in order to increase the occurrence of a desired behavior, but humanists would tell us that we can use positive reinforcement to affirm a person's social identity. So this was a peer conducting project that my students did, and here's an assessment that I used to evaluate them. In this case, they were evaluated on the criteria of their poise, their beat pattern, their breathing, and then other technical aspects of their gesture. After conducting a song that he actually arranged for the final project, one of my students said this: "Having the opportunity to teach a song that I made really showed me the passion that people have for writing and arranging music. I had not experienced this until I got to present a song that I had arranged." Finally, when it comes to fluency, I want my students to have skills and understandings that match the difficulty and the demands of the repertoire they're performing. I want them to be able to use the music language spontaneously and to have a sense of musical meaning infused into what they're doing. Now, the whole idea of fluency gets in a little bit into the idea of rote versus note. And I think that this debate still exists to some degree. We, as music educators, have not really decided how much of either approach should be used to develop the best musician. We can trace this all the way back to the late 1800s when Mason and Holt and Tufts were publishing their music learning series. And I think that probably the reaction to Mason's rote teaching led to a long period where we believed as a profession that the best musician was the one who could read the printed score. However, work like that done by Green and Clements, I think, is starting to overturn that idea, and now our profession is starting to see more value in the skills and the understandings of the person who plays by ear. So since I've been at IC, my students have done increasingly more singing by ear. I've been inspired by musicians like Bobby McFerrin and Edwin Gordon, Chris Azara, and Nick Page. But when I say sing by ear, I don't mean just learn the alto part to the Hallelujah chorus as I played on the piano. They are freely harmonizing and improvising as a way of acquiring musical meaning. I mentioned before that I think of fluency as being relative to the culture that it exists in, and because I also strongly value and see that our culture strongly values music literacy, I also teach my students to read and to write and to understand theory. When I want my students to demonstrate an understanding of form and texture, I ask them to draw me a picture. In this case, this was a project where students also wrote a written analysis as well as drawing this graphic representation of a song, which hits on both the iconic and the symbolic forms of learning that Bruner articulated. And I'm just going to go through these so that you can see how students have used color and shape and visual texture to represent different songs. For the final project for SVE, we really got to the heart of students and learning because the students were asked to pick a song, do an analysis of it and arrange it, record the parts that are going to be in their arrangement, either singing or playing on the keyboard, and then score it and teach it to the class. This was Anna's project, and you can see how she's labeled the chord progression all the way through the song, she's labeled the form, and then she's jotted down ideas about how she wants to use the voices in her arrangement, like two-part harmony and solo with oohs. As we skip ahead a few steps, she has scored it using MuseScore, which is a free downloadable software, and then she taught it to the class. One of the other arrangements that a student actually created for the same assignment was actually voted on by all the seniors in the choir to be sung at graduation, which was pretty cool. Because music fluency is really the heart of music learning, I have one more example for you. Based on my experience in vernacular musicianship, the class that I took last summer, and the work of Lucy Green, all throughout the year my students were given plenty of autonomous group arranging projects. I was hands-off, and I might have given them no guidelines, or I might have given them very specific guidelines. In this case, they had 3 days, which was short in terms of all the other projects. They had to pick a Beatles song, and they had to arrange it, not just copy the recording, while they demonstrated lots of different types of musical texture. And so here's an edited down version of one of their products, and you're going to see one of the students' notes as well.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone and some remain. All these places have their moments with lovers and friends. I still can recall. Some are dead and some are living. In my life, I love them all. Though I know I've never shares affection for people and things that went before. I know all love can stop them, about them. In my life, I love you more. In my life, I love you more.
At the end of the year, I asked the students in this class just to write and reflect on what this different learning approach, how it was significant for their own learning. And here's some things they said just for the sake of time. I'm just going to read the last one. Unlike any other classes I've ever had in my life, small vocal ensemble was a time of day when my mind could go crazy with new ideas, and I could test them out and create beautiful things out of them. I'm going to leave you today with one of those crazy ideas that this student was talking about. Inspired by my independent study that I did last summer, I asked my students for their midterm project to design their own project. They had to tell me what they were going to do, the process they would go through to complete it, the skills that they learned in class that they'd be using, and then also the criteria that they wanted me to use to assess them. And so this set of twins decided they were going to write their own song, and they wanted me to evaluate them based on the effectiveness of their lyrics, the quality of the composition, both harmonically and melodically, and then the overall performance of the recording that they were going to make. Here's their lyric sheet and the rubric that I created based on those suggestions. And during this whole time, the girls did not ask me for help at all, so I didn't actually hear the song until they played the recording for the class. And I was really blown away. And I said, we really need to do something else with this. And they told me that because they have lots of younger sisters, that they wrote this song with them in mind and the idea of hope for a better world for them in the future. So we decided that the 6th grade chorus should sing the song. And they started to score it, and I picked up where they left off. And the girls came and they performed it for the 6th graders the day that the 6th graders started learning it. And then we ended up closing the concert with the song. And I have just a short clip of that performance.
Soldier falls down on his knees in despair. Reaching around is just too much to bear. Brother man loses, a young father dies. The last desperate plea, he looks up and he cries for one day with peace throughout the nation. One day.
The coolest thing about this was that the set of twins, as well as the piano player in this performance, who was also a member of the SVE class, they both had younger sisters that were in the 6th grade chorus. I asked the 6th graders right at the end of the concert, actually the next day, just to talk about what their favorite part of the concert was, and most of them said something like this. One day was my favorite because it was made by students at our school. My favorite part was one day because the audience was interacting with us. My favorite part of the concert was singing One Day because we put the most emotion in it. Now, based on that performance and these comments, you can see how relevance and esteem and fluency were at work in this whole experience, and I could tell that the 6th graders really connected to something special, as well as the audience. And it's this type of project, this type of multifaceted experience that I see as being the vision for my program that I want to incorporate more and more in the future. That said, I've been talking purely about my vocal music program, but a major part of my teaching responsibilities also include teaching general music. My general music teaching has definitely evolved quite a bit since I started at IC, but I feel like it has further to go before it catches up with everything that I shared with you today. In reflecting on my growth over the past 3 summers, I noticed a bit of irony in the fact that for my Ithaca admissions essay, I wrote about relevant curriculum for the general music classroom. And now I feel like it's relevance that's the biggest thing missing in this part of my teaching. So at the beginning of this next school year, at the start of each one of my general music classes, I plan to undergo a very intentional process of getting to know my students, understanding their experiences, and hopefully showing them how much music is already very much a part of their lives. And then we can use this as a springboard for creating expressive experiences in this other setting. In all of this, I've realized that relevance and esteem and fluency can be present in the classroom, but we as teachers still need to teach expressively. Our students still need to have an expressive model if they're going to learn to be expressive themselves. If I think about the times when I've struggled in my teaching, it's because these things were not actually present and secure for myself. If I was underprepared for a class, I was lacking fluency. If I was nervous about how students were going to respond to a lesson, I was lacking esteem. And if I was butting heads with a student, it's because I was failing to make that student's experience relevant to my own. All of these things just kept me from being myself in the classroom. Rogers says that teachers need to be aware of and be comfortable with their own emotional lives so that they can be real with their students. And what I know now is that I need to ensure that relevance and esteem and fluency are present in my own teaching. And if I do this, as well as use these qualities to guide my students towards expressive experiences with music, then I believe I'm fulfilling my greatest responsibility as a music educator. Thank you.